What did they do with the bodies of dead gladiators? The truth will chill your blood. The sand was still warm when the crowd began to leave. The smell of blood, sweat, and metal hung in the air like an invisible mist, impossible to ignore. It had been a great spectacle. 2 men had fought to the death beneath the roar of 50,000 throats, hungry for violence, and in the end, as always, one remained standing, and the other lay still on the ground, eyes wide open to the Roman sky that gave no answer. But now that the applause had faded, the part no one wanted to see was just beginning. The raw truth, the one the Empire kept hidden in the shadows. What happened to the bodies of dead gladiators? What you're about to hear isn't in the official history books. They didn't paint it on the villa walls or recite it in poems. Because what happened to these men after death wasn't glory. It was business, it was silence, it was cruelty. If you're here, I want you to comment just one word: honor, because that precisely is what these men were never given. When a gladiator fell, there was no orchestra, no respectful silence, no flags lowered. He fell like a sack of meat, heavy and lifeless, often unarmed, neck twisted or belly torn open. After that moment of tension, when the crowd turned to the emperor to see whether he would live or die, everything was decided with a flick of the thumb. If that thumb pointed down, it was final. The victor received glory, the defeated oblivion. But death was not the end. It was the beginning of another story. The cleanup crews entered immediately, not soldiers, not priests, slaves, men invisible to the city, yet essential to its machinery. They dragged the bodies away with chains around their necks, or hooks stabbed into their legs, not out of personal cruelty, but out of speed and efficiency. The stage had to be cleared for the next fight. Sometimes 3 or 4 corpses remained at once, and every minute that passed increased the risk of infection, disease, and stench. The bodies were taken down into underground corridors, dark, damp spaces far from the eyes of the public. What happened down there was known to only a few, and spoken of by none. Gladiators were considered legal property, not citizens, not soldiers, not men. They were investments, owned by a lanista, a blood businessman who trained and rented them out like horses. When one died, the body still legally belonged to the lanista, and it was up to him to decide what to do with it. The most famous gladiators, those who had fought many times, who had earned some fame, who perhaps had even been freed and returned to fight voluntarily, might receive a modest burial. Sometimes their fellow gladiators would pool together money to cremate them, or buy a tomb with a simple inscription. But most simply vanished. The bodies were sold to doctors. Rome didn't have forensic science, but it had an intense fascination with the human body. Physicians like Galen, who would be revered for centuries, learned by watching how a lance entered a femur or how a trident pierced a lung. The corpse of a gladiator was a live anatomy class, literally. Some were dissected in secret, away from the religious elite who saw such practices as sacrilege. But knowledge was more valuable than superstition, and in Rome, the pain of the dead didn't matter. Others were used for something more grotesque. Fat extraction, that's right. There was a belief, both magical and medical, that the fat of a brave gladiator had special properties. It gave strength, cured epilepsy, healed the skin, and acted as an aphrodisiac. Some shady merchants would buy the bodies from the lanista, boil them in enormous vats, and bottle the melted fat like sacred oil. It was sold on street corners, in brothels, and in training schools, a pseudoscience as ancient as it was repulsive. But even that wasn't the worst fate. The worst fate was reserved for those whose bodies were worth nothing. Not to the lanista, not to the doctors, not even to the magicians. These were the ones fed to the beasts. The same animals that took part in hunting shows and public executions had to eat, and, often, their meals were human flesh. It wasn't practical to bring in fresh meat from Africa for the lions. it was far cheaper and more convenient to use the leftover corpses at the end of the day. Some were thrown into the cages still warm. Others had already begun to rot. The animals, without judgment or guilt, fulfilled their role, and so a man who had once been cheered by thousands could end up torn apart by a bear, his blood soaking into the straw, while another slave watched in silence. But the most common fate was disappearance, outside the city walls. There were places called puticuli, open pits where unclaimed bodies were tossed. No tombstone, no ceremony, sometimes not even a cloth to cover the face. The bodies were stacked, one atop the other, covered with quicklime to speed decomposition and prevent outbreaks of disease. Some pits were so full they formed hills visible from the road. Few dared walk nearby at dusk, and those who did claim to hear moans rising from the ground. Still, not everything was forgotten. Some gladiators created small funeral societies, something like death cooperatives. They paid monthly from their meager wages, so that if one of them died, the others would ensure a proper burial. It wasn't about religion. It was about fear, because they knew they could be next out. Because death wasn't the worst thing. The worst was to leave no trace. Rome spoke of glory, of honor, of bravery, but only as long as you were useful. Once you stopped generating entertainment or profit, you became trash. A shadow, a memory not worth retelling. That's why gladiators who survived many battles were seen almost as gods, not just for their strength, but for having outlived a system designed to kill and forget them. Staying alive was an act of rebellion, but even those few survivors knew their time was running out. No one grew old in the arena. Some bought their freedom after years of service, but even then they lived marked with scars, with trauma, with the guilt of having killed, and of having watched others die. Blood doesn't wash off the soul. That's why, even outside the Colosseum, many slept on the ground, ate in silence, and died young. But there was something else. Something whispered in back alleys and behind training walls, a truth not recorded, but passed through rumors and nods. The business didn't end with the body. It sometimes continued with the name. When a gladiator died famous, cheered, admired, remembered, his identity became valuable. Some Lannistas recycled names. They trained a new slave, gave him the same nickname, and threw him back into the arena. The crowd, hungry for myth, rarely questioned it. "He's back," they'd say. "Spiculus has returned." The illusion was profitable. The new fighter wore the name like a mask, repeating the gestures, the stance, the war cry. But inside, he was just another body walking in the shadow of a dead man. In this way, some names outlived the men who bore them. They became useful ghosts, brands, merchandise. In Rome, even identity was for sale. They weren't murders. They were processes. Rome had turned them into procedures, cold and efficient. Every death followed a system. Fall, verdict, final blow, removal, disappearance, no improvisation, just routine. And that routine turned thousands of men into shapeless memories, unmarked corpses, stories never told. Until now, today, we walk through Rome and see ruins, marble, columns, arches, but underneath, in the guts of that eternal city, sleep the screams of men who fought without choice, men not born for war, but shaped into weapons by an empire that saw them as disposable, and when they were no longer useful, they were discarded as if they never existed. And yet, here you are, listening, giving voice to what was once silence, recovering, even if just for a moment. The memory of those who gave everything for a round of applause that lasted only seconds. That's more than many of them received in life. Some gladiators formed friendships deeper than brotherhood, bonds forged through mud, blood and fear. When one of them fell, the other mourned quietly, and if he could, if no one caught him, he would steal the body, yes, steal it at night, he would sneak into the burial pits, retrieve the corpse, wrap it in stolen cloth from the kitchen, and bury it in a hidden place. A grove, a hill, a crack in the rocks. This act was a crime, but also a gesture of love, because in the end, the only dignity a gladiator could hope for was the one another gladiator gave him. The system didn't give it, Rome didn't give it, but his brother in blood did, because he knew that tomorrow it might be him. And he hoped, he begged, that someone would do the same. And this is where the story changes, because although thousands were forgotten, some names survived time, not because Rome preserved them, but because someone refused to forget them. A slave who carved a name into stone, a scribe who wrote down a fight on a wax tablet, an archaeologist who uncovered bones beside a dented bronze helmet, fragments, echoes, traces. The history of the gladiators isn't complete, but it's still alive now. Say it out loud. What word stayed with you through all this? Was it rage? Was it respect? Was it pain? It doesn't matter. Whatever it is, type it in the comments, because as long as someone remembers them, no gladiator is truly dead.